Hello, everyone. Welcome to your very first psychology slideshow. Now, this is the way that we're going to be doing a majority of our learning, so be prepared, I guess, for everything that comes with PowerPoint. All right, here you see an overview of everything that we will be talking about in this PowerPoint. This is all chapter 1 in your psychology textbooks. Because we can't have any discussions, I kind of sent everyone an email so we can really talk about, the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about psychology. So we have expectations about psychology. We'll talk about that a little bit. What is psychology? The roots of psychology, modern approaches of psychology, modern psychology perspectives, goals of psychology, the scientific method, which hopefully you guys remember from high school, types of studies, ethics and psychological research. That one's fun. And then we'll see if you guys have any questions. So what is psychology and what comes to your mind when we talk about psychology? So I asked this in an email to all of my psychology students, and this slide represents a majority of the answers. So a way of determining why people are the way they are, a study of the mind or a study of the brain, child development, images and chemical components, how the mind is like a maze, and how we were raised. These are all correct, so you all seem to have a very firm grasp on what psychology is. Okay, this slide represents things that people commonly think of when it comes to psychology. So the first one you see is the Rorschach test. That's the ink blot test. So a lot of times the psychologist will ask what images you see, and then based on your answer, they will, find out that your unconscious brain is really thinking about something else. The second one is laying on the couch, which is a lot of preconceptions about therapy. The next one shows the abandoned ham sandwich, and it could very well be a psychology test. Next, we've got our good friend, Sigmund Freud. He is a very major part of psychology, and a lot of times he's the only psychologist that people know. So he, is all about finding the unconscious. He wants to know about dreams and your parents and sex and all sorts of stuff like that. So the next one is preconceptions about reading minds and brainwashing. People think of movies like A Beautiful Mind or Good Will Hunting, which have some truth to them, but there is more to psychology than that. What is psychology? Psychology comes from Greek words. So the Greek and Latin roots, psyche means breath or soul, and logia, which means the study of. The book definition is found on page 4 in your textbook, and it is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So to sum up, it's basically the study of you and everyone around you. So how we think, work, learn, remember, etc. It's applicable in everyday life. We learn how to think critically, we pay attention to pop psychology, and we learn about ourselves in the process. One thing psychology is not, it's common sense. So we observe things that we think are true, but they might not be. I fall for this all the time. For an example, the way that women fall in love versus men falling in love. So the saying opposites attract, when really it's birds of a feather flock together. This is a soft science because of its subjectiveness. Nothing is ever concrete in psychology because every subject is unique. Medicine can be a soft science in similar ways. You know the basic rules, but there are always exceptions, and each body is different in some way in treatment. This is also known as a crossover science, as it ties into biology, medicine, technological advances, history, sociology, anthropology, basically everything. So we will cover later how it is a science and how it is studied. But first we're going to go over its roots. Psychology is used everywhere, not just on the couch or crazy studies, but it is used in business, industrial psychology, teaching, educational psychology, forensic psychology, etc. Basically, you cannot get away from it. In this slide, we just see a little bit more about specialties in psychology and kind of what you could do if you really wanted to get into a psychology field. All right, our first key point is going to be the father of psychology. So if you have your index cards ready, go ahead and write on the front side, father of psychology. If you're using Cornell Notes, that is amazing. Go ahead and write that in your key points column. Now we will find out who the father of psychology really is. It is none other than Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wundt was the very first person to ever establish a psychology lab. So the first person that ever had a lab just for studying the way we think and the way we do things. He also was the first person to really focus on introspection, the idea of looking inside yourself and reflecting on what you could do and why you did what you did. A lot of times this is referred to as structuralism. After Wundt, there was a founding of something called functionalism. It wasn't really tied to any one person, but William James is known as one of the biggest proponents for it. James didn't agree with Wundt and his focus on elements of consciousness. He thought processes developed from evolution. So think of Darwin here. In other words, we do something because there is a need to do it that developed somewhere along the line. What function does such a process serve? James didn't care about the elements as much as the cause, the why. He was very tied to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and the traits and behaviors that enhance survival stick around, and those that don't, they die. So this is natural selection in a nutshell. And this idea persists still to this day. The way that we see how behaviors are not always innate, but rather developed. So some of you guys answered about psychology being about the way you were raised. So this is kind of where that steps in. It's a nature versus nurture. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Freud. Just kidding, don't raise your hand, you can't. Or you can and I can't see you. Freud is probably the most well-known psychologist, but he's not the father of psych. Remember, Wundt is the father of psychology. Freud started in medicine. He was a medical doctor, and he saw what he called nervous attacks, which is kind of the thing that we now know of as mental illnesses. Um, and he really was interested in getting to the root of those issues. Freud led to the founding of psychoanalytic theory, the unconscious mind, which is, what are your secret desires and who are you secretly mad at, conflicts and things like that, and how they affect outward behaviors. Freud saw studying conflict between natural sexual and aggressive desires and conscious reasoning as a way to understand human behavior. One way he worked to find the root of medical problems was free association or word association, which is say whatever comes to your mind. So a lot of times in English class, your English teacher might have, had a writing prompt or something about like, okay, if I say the word blue, everybody name whatever comes to mind. So Freud used this as a science. He was also known for the study of unconscious. This is where we kind of get into the dream interpretation. He kind of helped solidify our id, ego, and superego. And he also dealt a lot in sexuality, which was very risque for this time. Not so much now, but definitely back in the 1800s. All right, time to take out another index card. And on the front, we are going to write the father of psychoanalysis. So again, if you're doing Cornell notes, this is a key point. And of course, we all know from hopefully the last slide who the father of psychoanalysis is, and it is Sigmund Freud. Another early approach of psychology is behaviorism. Behaviorism started to focus on only what is observable, as opposed to what's in the mind. So this was a jumpstart for a lot of psychologists, such as Pavlov. So Pavlov had his experiment with his dog and salivation, which is the stimulus and response. So basically, Pavlov would ring a bell and give his dog a treat, and ring a bell and give his dog a treat, and ring a bell and give his dog a treat. And then eventually, when he would ring a bell, the dog would naturally drool, not just for a treat, but because he heard the bell ringing. John B. Watson was also a famous behaviorist, and he did an experiment, much like Pavlov, about stimulus and response, only he used a baby. So his experiment was on little Albert, and he had a white rat. And then my good friend B.F. Skinner also expanded on that work. So once little Albert was conditioned to fear the rat, what would he do? What were the consequences? Would he move away to reduce anxiety? Would he attack the rat? It's understood that if his action provided positive consequences, that behavior would be repeated. We're going to cover more of this later in a different chapter, all about conditioning. And then also, if you go to my channel link of YouTube's, you will be able to find the actual experiment that John B. Watson did on poor little Albert. To clear this up, it's not this Skinner, it's this Skinner. All right, here's another slide that talks about the little Albert experiment. And it's an example of how classical conditioning can be used to condition an emotional response. So basically what happened is Watson put little Albert out on a blanket and started bringing a lot of different animals by. So there was a dog, a cat, a bunny, and let little Albert kind of pet all these animals and interact with them. And then he brought out a white rat. Every single time little Albert was near the white rat, they would make a very loud noise. So this loud noise would scare little Albert. So that's how they conditioned him. They conditioned him to kind of fear the white rat because it makes a loud noise. However, what they ended up discovering is that there were positive consequences and negative consequences. So the positive was that little Albert would pull away and begin to self-soothe, which is really important in, babies' development, being able to self-soothe. The negative consequence was, of course, that now little Albert was conditioned to fear rats. All right, next index card. On the front side, our key point is behaviorism. On the back side of this card, the definition of behaviorism, which is observable responses and behaviors. Next index card on the front side, we are looking for the behaviorists. On the back side, we're going to write the behaviorists, who are Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Just a reminder, it's not the Skinner from The Simpsons, but it's the rat experiment Skinner. All right, grab another index card. And on the front, we're going to write Pavlov. All right, and on the back side of that index card, we are going to write stimulus/response. And for Pavlov and his dog, it was bell/salivation. So the bell was the stimulus and the salivation was the response. And yet again, on another index card on the front side, we are going to write Watson. On the back, we have classical conditioning. So this is the little Albert experiment. And again, they're studying stimuli and responses, unconditioned and conditioned. All right, and on yet another index card on the front side, we are going to write Skinner. And I'm sure we know which Skinner that we're talking about and which one we're not. Just in case we don't know which Skinner we're talking about, it's not this Skinner from The Simpsons. It is this Skinner from the rat experiment. All right, so on the back side of our index card, we are going to write operant conditioning, which is different from classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, consequence is bad and the action is not repeated. If the consequence is good, the action is repeated. So basically, rewards increase good behavior, whereas punishment decreases bad behavior. Another approach of psychology was humanism. For humanism, it's important to look at the time period. So it was the 1960s and society was changing. There were race issues, sex issues, war, and psychologists needed a more hopeful view of humanity other than us simply responding to the stimuli in the environment. So psychologists acknowledged that change can be made from within, from personal choice and human growth. We can be more, and the emphasis was on free will. Now, cognitive psychology developed as the behaviorists were so limited in studies with only observable things. So a cognitive perspective explains behavior with an emphasis on thoughts and interpretations based on memory, expectations, beliefs, problem solving, or decision making. Everyone grab your handy dandy index cards, and on the front side, we are going to write humanism. Now flip that card over, and on the back side, we are going to write personal growth and human potential. Modern psychology perspectives are obviously a little bit of everything. We have behavioral perspective, biological, evolutionary, sociocultural, psychodynamic, cognitive, and humanistic. The behavioral perspective focuses on the external or environmental causes for behavior. The biological perspective looks for physical cause for behavior, like genetics or chemical imbalances. The evolutionary perspective focuses on how evolution and natural selection cause behavior. This is similar to functionalism, kind of. The cognitive perspective explains behavior as a product of mental processes, so how thoughts and interpretations influence behaviors. Psychodynamic perspective focuses on internal and unconscious to explain behavior. So it sounds a little bit like Freud and his psychoanalytic theory. Sociocultural perspective focuses on societal and cultural factors that influence behavior. So think about how other cultures think of a reflexive behavior like a sneeze. Not all sneezes are looked at the same way they are in our culture. The humanistic perspective focuses on a view of self and world-influencing behaviors. Today we take what's called an eclectic approach, and that's how most psychologists treat the world now. It combines several perspectives, and it is more complete than any one of these. So no one theory is more correct than another. What are the goals of psychology? The goals of psychology are to describe behavior, just find out what people are doing and how they're acting. Another goal is to predict behavior, and that's often a result from describing. After observing, one may be able to make predictions. And then tests come out of this. Predict what you think will happen and then test it out. Another goal of psychology is to explain the behavior. If you see a connection or describe something, now is the time to ask why. Look for the causes for these things. Often part of research too And finally, another goal of psychology is to control or change the behavior. So once you see an action and usually find out why it's like that, then you can learn how to change it. Sometimes you'll discover the why, sometimes you won't. But all these things tie together in the research that psychologists do and what they want to do with their work. We all do this, whether we realize it or not. We may not look at it scientifically, but we all do this in our daily lives. Handy dandy index card, and the front side will say goals of psychology. On the back side, we are going to write describe, predict, explain, and control, change, modify behavior. The scientific method is what makes psychology a science. So this process is followed in all of the sciences, and I'm sure you remember doing, some experiment with this in middle school or high school. I know I've done them with my son. The tests are all different, and they might be looking at different subjects, but the method is always the same. So you can define and describe the issue. Form a testable hypothesis, so that's where you're going to predict. Choose an appropriate research strategy. Conduct the study to test your hypothesis, and then analyze the data. So to sum it up, basically it's what are you interested in? What do you think is going on? Figure out how to test it, do it, and then explain why you were right or wrong. And on our next index card of fun, on the front side, we are going to write the scientific method. And on the back side of this index card, we are going to write define problem, form hypothesis, choose strategy, conduct study, and analyze data. Different types of studies. One of them is naturalistic observations, which is watching situations as they occur without interference. This helps establish validity of a study. If you observe something in your study in real life, you can fairly and honestly say that your results extend to the general population. This is a helpful study type when you can't cause something. So, for example, it is definitely not ethical to try to develop PTSD in a person just so you can study it. So, you need to watch the people who already have it. That seems kind of like a no-brainer to me. You cannot control events or factors. It's not possible to pinpoint causes that way. And we have to be aware of reactivity because people will act differently when they know they're being observed. And simply being present can change observations. So another type of study is the case study. So the case study is looking at one person. It definitely focuses on the description goal of psychology. It's beneficial when something is rare, not a lot of subjects to choose from, and it allows for in-depth observations. So you can focus on all aspects of one individual or thing rather than having an entire sample to look at. Case studies cannot control variables or change anything. It is literally just observing another person and whatever event you're interested in. It's one person, hard to generalize and apply to the general population. It's also very difficult to replicate. Another type of study is the correlation study. So correlations cannot find causes, but you can find and test relationships between variables. You can't control anything here, and even if you do, you still won't know what the other variables are playing into what you're testing. It's not always necessarily experiments. It's often tested with other means, such as surveys and questionnaires. There is, and I hate to bring math into this, there is a correlation coefficient. So this is closer to 1 on either end is stronger correlation. 0 is no correlation. So think of a number line from -1 to +1. -1 is total correlation, +1 total correlation, 0, right smack dab in the middle, is no correlation. Positive correlation, as one variable increases, another also increases, or as one decreases, the other decreases. The negative correlation is as one variable increases, the other decreases, an inverse relationship. If there's no correlation, you got nothing. There's no way to test cause. You may know that A and B are related, but you can't know if A causes B or if B causes A, or if C is causing both. All right, get out another index card, and on the front side, we are going to write naturalistic observations. Once that card is flipped over on the back side, we are going to write behaviors observed in natural environment. On the next index card on the front side, we are going to write case study. Then on the back of that index card, we are going to write observation of one participant. Get out another index card. On the front, we are going to write correlational studies. And then on the back, we're going to write relationship between two or more variables without control of variables. In yet another type of study, we have experiments. So experiments are research methods that are used to test causal hypotheses. So an independent variable is the variable the experimenter manipulates, and the dependent variable is the result from the manipulation. So if you're testing memory and room temperature, you're manipulating room temperature, and the dependent is the memory test results. A confounding variable is a variable that wasn't controlled that may influence the relationship. For example, in a sleep study, age or gender may be a confounding variable. Random assignments are when participants have an equal chance of being placed in any group. This helps you make a representative sample for the population you're studying. A quasi-experiment, I love that word by the way, quasi, is the same as an experiment except no random assignment. People will already be in groups. So, for example, a smoking study. People already smoke or don't smoke. It's not ethical to place anyone in a different group than what they already are. Experiments help causal relationships be established, which therefore allows us to reach other psychology goals. Ethical guidelines for participants. And honestly, I have to say that discussing the ethical side of psychological experiments is one of my favorite things. All right, so there is something called the IRB, and it stands for Institutional Review Board. They review and pass your proposals. Basically, they're there to make sure that all of the ethical standards are being followed. All right, and informed consent is to let participants know about the potential risks. It also includes rewards that they might get, the process of how everything works, and sometimes, but not always, the purpose of the study. Sometimes, however, the purpose has to be concealed to maintain the integrity of the study. If they were deceived about the purpose of the study and misled during the informed consent, debriefing is essential. Debriefing is good practice in any study to fully disclose purpose of the research study. This can include results of study or how to find out what the results were after the write-up. It's time to repair any of the damage you might have done from that study. And just like in medicine, confidentiality is important. You must keep personal information extremely private, lock it up. And then we have Stanley Milgram, who helped bring us the IRB. So Stanley Milgram's test, essentially, his experiment took place back before the IRB was a thing. If you want to watch the Stanley Milgram shock study, go to our YouTube channel, and it's one of the extra videos. It's a little horrifying. Basically, in a nutshell, Milgram brought in volunteers, telling them they would be part of a learning experiment. And I believe this took place at Yale University. So they were mostly students. He also had a staff of his own quote-unquote volunteers show up, because really the experiment was secretly about following authority. So the Milgram and the people in charge would split up everyone into one of two roles. You were either a learner or the authority. So little did anyone know that every single real volunteer was given the position of authority, and every single staff volunteer was given the position of the learner. What would happen is the authority would start taking the learners through some memory training. And whenever wrong answers were given, then the authority was to give them an electric shock. And what would happen is over time, the electric shocks would escalate in not only frequency, but also intensity. So because the learners are all staff members, it was their job to scream and writhe in pain and pretend like they were dying from all these electric shocks. The authority figures, or the actual volunteers, were told that they had to, for the sake of the study, keep shocking no matter what. And what happened was that almost every authority kept on shocking until it got to the death dose of electricity. And when all was said and done, the authority volunteers were extremely harmed psychologically from, even after their debrief, just from the thought that they were told to essentially torture someone to death. All right, thankfully, there are also ethical guidelines for animals. So for psychology, there are very few studies that actually use animals. But the IRB is still needed for that. And humane treatment is required of all animals for any experiment. So you must feed the animals. You have to house them nicely. You have to clean them and clean their cages. And all harmful procedures have to be completely justified. Like there is no other choice or reason for doing that experiment. All right, we're going to take our very last index card. And on the front side, we are going to write IRB. On the back side of that card, you're going to say that they protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects, and they also ensure ethical standards have been met. Holy cow, you guys made it. Woo! This was the longest PowerPoint that I have ever done, and I can't wait to do more.